it actually is beneficial to have a co-ed experience as much as possible, if not continue it through life. Because what you're doing then is you're telling the boys that it's not about necessarily gender, right? That it's about athleticism, that it's about, what are you able to accomplish in your sport, or how hard are you working at your craft? That is where we really should be looking at, is where do we separate individuals in terms of skill level, not necessarily by sex or gender.
Hello and welcome to the Ninjababes podcast. I'm very excited today because I'm here with a professor from Keene State College. It's Dr. Fitni Destani, and I'm excited to talk to him today because, as you know, if you've been listening to the podcast, we've gotten a lot into topics about gender differences, especially as it pertains to Ninja Warrior and sports. And it's a topic that we've been talking a ton about the last few months. And a lot of us have a lot of questions about, those of us who are in the older generation of ninjas who look at the younger generation. A lot of us wonder, if we start separating courses now, how could that possibly be detrimental to the potential that these girls have? Because right now they're growing up in a sport where they're always together with the guys. They always train together, and they see no reason to feel like they should be less than in their performance or in their abilities. And so we really want to dive in today of what does it really look like from a mental aspect. If we separate courses, what is the effect of males and females being separate in sports or being together? How could that be positive or negative? So we want to dive more into those physical performance aspects today with Dr. Destani. And so the reason why we brought him on today, Mary Layton, some of you might know Mary. She's doing some work for me to find some great people to bring onto the podcast. So I'm really excited to have him. But he specializes in human performance and movement science, and really the psychosocial aspects of sports. So we're really excited to have him on. Before we dive into this episode, I wanted to tell you about an important partner of Ninjababes. Propello Life is an all-natural wellness and nutrition company that Ninjababes has worked with for well over a year. I love working with this company because they're family-owned. All of their products are all-natural, non-GMO, and not only do they taste great, but I feel great taking them. If you've ever taken pre-workout before and you feel like you've gotten hit by a truck or your heart is going to explode, their products are not like that. Their products are all natural. They'll give you that natural boost of energy if you're taking the energy and focus blend. If you take the pre-workout, you will feel that hype, but it's not the same as some of those other chemical-based companies that will leave you with dry mouth, cause you to overly sweat, and all these other weird side effects. So if you're looking for a company that has great all-natural products, they even have vegan and whey proteins, definitely check out Propello Life. Best of all, if you go over to propellolife.com and use code Ninjababes, all caps, you'll get 10% off your order and free shipping, and you'll be supporting the Ninjababes podcast. So if you're looking for a way to get amazing products that taste great and that supplement your nutrition, and a way to support the Ninjababes, head on over to propellolife.com and use code Ninjababes on your order, and you won't be sorry. Thanks for your support, and thank you for trying out Propello Life. So welcome. How are you?
Good. I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm also excited because it's a women's focused podcast, and a lot of times we usually only have women talking on the podcast. So it's nice to have you.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
So can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into your field and just a bit more about your background?
Sure. Well, I'm originally from New Jersey and born and raised in New Jersey. And so I was in a melting pot, lots of different diversity and people from, all parts of the world. And so I really enjoyed growing up in New Jersey for that fact. I think some people, prefer not. But I think there's so much to learn by being around such diversity. I grew up really kind of playing in the streets of New Jersey, in the city areas. And one of the big things that we always did as kids, and I talk about this in my classes, a true informal sports or sandlot experience is really about having this idea of whoever wants to play can play. And so we never discouraged anyone, regardless of who they were in terms of their race or gender or age even, and size or abilities to participate with us in any of the games we had in the streets. And that's how I learned sport, to just play with whoever wanted to play. And so I've always thought about the psychology of sport. And sure enough, I go through high school and I have to decide what to do in terms of my career. And I chose psychology initially. And, I went to University of California, Santa Barbara. And in my psychology pursuits, I had to pick a specialization. And then I took sports psychology in my last semester. It took all the way into my last semester. And I decided that that was going to be a course I was going to take to see what it's like. And I was just really turned on by the content and the information, got me excited, and I wanted to go into graduate school to study it further. So I ended up going to San Francisco State University and completed my master's degree in sports science. Technically, it was sports psychology, but they called it sports science. And I got really influenced by my mentor, Misu Kim. And she was really instrumental in teaching me about sports psychology, but really the power and the impact that a social environment has on individuals. And so I was more steered towards youth, working with her. And so I focused a lot on working with inner city youth at risk. I worked with some people using teaching personal social responsibility in the inner city of San Francisco. And so I saw some really great results with that, and it got me excited to go to a doctoral program. And I went to University of Utah to study for psychosocial aspects of sport under Maria Newton. And I was also fortunate to be there with Dr. Keith Henshin, who was at the time the current sports psychologist of the Utah Jazz. So I was well trained, and I was also getting a lot of great applied experiences out there in the real world in terms of using the information that I've gained in these youth settings. So my experiences are a lot of times more in the youth side, and I ended up going into physical education, and my job landed me in Keene State College, teaching within the PE program. But I, again, am a trained mental performance coach from University of Utah with my doctorate, and I work with athletes at Keene State College most of the time on a one-on-one basis as needed, because I do have a full teaching load and lots of service. And so one of the things that I do is every semester I teach psychosocial aspects of sport, and it's largely athletes that take that course. But if I'm looking at gender, since we're talking about gender, I would say that it's a pretty even split, maybe even more females taking that course than males. And so we dive into, interesting topics like this. And so as soon as I, got the information from Mary about this topic, I was excited about being able to talk about gender and the role of gender in sport, but also psychologically, how that plays a role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. I love hearing your whole background, and there's such a scope of experience there. I think it's interesting because something that I'm thinking about while you're talking is in Ninja Warrior. I can speak for like the adult perspective. I'm 31 myself. I've been competing in Ninja now for 3 years. And something that the women pride ourselves on is how we're willing to get out there, we're willing to take risks and do challenges, get dirty on the course. I literally just ripped my hands open yesterday doing on an obstacle that tears your skin. So it's like so many of us are like, yeah, we're here, we're ready to go after this with the best of our ability, and we train with the guys, we compete against the guys, and we've always been so proud of that. But I think what's kind of come up for a lot of us is that we train really hard, and there's usually those top elite women that end up beating all the guys or doing just as well as all the guys. But then for a lot of us, we are in training, maybe in practice, like we're doing the same courses where we can do the same obstacles, but when it's in the courses, it seems like we're constantly falling behind as far as in our performance as where we land on the podium. And so like Ninja Warrior didn't even always start having a separate men and women's podium. It used to be we're all just on the same podium, and then eventually it kind of separated out where, okay, well, we're still all doing the same courses, but now we're going to have separate podiums to recognize the women's accomplishments. And there's so much I could say, but I'm curious to hear your perspective. But I know that there's been when I first started Ninja, it was like every single time a woman would get an obstacle for the first time, it was a huge celebration. And that's great. And I think, we need those celebrations. But then I think some girls were starting to feel a little bit of a certain way, like, well, why are you clapping for me for getting the warp wall when all the guys can do the warp wall and you don't clap for any of them? It's like expected that they'll get it, but it's not expected that I'll get it. And that just kind of began to stir up these feelings of, I don't want to say resentment, but kind of like this feeling of we're just as good as the guys, but we want to feel like we're just as good as the guys. And like, we don't always perform that way, but I know we're capable of performing that way. So there's a lot of thoughts going on.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that you're talking about there is expectations, right? I talk a lot about this in class. One of the big things in sports psychology and as a mental performance coach is, we always think about developing a profile of an athlete. Regardless of gender, we're looking at their psychological profile. So what are some of the areas that you have of strength? What are some areas that could use improvements? And what we do is we dive in on what those might be. And when we talk about expectations, we always want to find out what are the expectations of the athlete has of themselves moving forward. And then not only of themselves, but what are the expectations outside of themselves? And what you're referring to there is really the outside expectations. If we lower expectations from the outside, then you could be, setting a lower bar for the athlete. And that makes it really difficult for then that person to achieve the goals that they want to achieve because they're setting lower, smaller, more easily acceptable goals, as opposed to things that are more moderate to difficult that can, over time, lead to them achieving the more important goals that they're trying to strive for. So I would like to start really kind of by talking about how we separate genders, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the big things is I look at sport in general, right? So you're talking about Ninjababes, but I'm talking about, looking at the entire sport spectrum. And I teach in PE, and I've also, do a lot of research, read a lot of research in youth programs and youth sports. And really, there's not a whole lot of statistical differences in terms of athletic performance when we're looking at boys and girls before, say, the age of 12, right? And there's even arguments after the age of 12 whether or not those differences aren't really due to the fact that we changed those expectations for girls based on the fact that they've now entered into puberty. And so now the expectations have been lowered and that they're not going to be as strong or not going to be able to compete with the boys. And maybe we should separate the genders at this point. But there's some real disadvantages with that model. And as you invited me into this podcast, one of the things that I started doing is I read a little bit more about it, right? And so some of the things that I came up on from the research is that, the big factor here is what are you losing when you separate the girls from the boys? One is that more oftentimes is that, again, you're saying they're not as athletic, right? So that to even the playing field, you're going to separate them so they can get recognized in an supposed equitable way, so that they can be recognized in their athletic accomplishments in that sport. But at the same time, you're also telling the boys that the girls are not able to compete with you, and you're also creating this view in their mind as well that they can't compete. And it actually is beneficial to have a co-ed experience as much as possible, if not continue it through life. Because what you're doing then is you're telling the boys that it's not about necessarily gender, right? That it's about athleticism, that it's about, what are you able to accomplish in your sport? Or how hard are you working at your craft? That is where we really should be looking at, is where do we separate individuals in terms of skill level, not necessarily by sex or gender.
Yeah, that's so important. And that makes a lot of sense when you when you hear it back that way. Do you think that, one thing I had written down earlier even was just thinking about the point of, if girls who are younger aren't separated out and they're left in co-ed classes at the gym and whatnot. Just that expectation of we can be on an even playing field together, and there shouldn't be this difference in my skill or your skill, male or female. Do you think that that's something that just naturally uh, it'll continue, like that mindset will continue, or do you think it's that challenge of other outside factors? Maybe in gym class they're separated, or maybe on TV they see other sports separated. Like, do you think you could preserve that expectation of we can compete together well
Yeah.
within that one space?
One of the things that is important is knowing the audience, and I'm assuming that some of the coaches are listening in, and some of the athletes are listening in. And I would urge the coaches and also those athletes to really, think about their experiences thus far and what they've seen in terms of the results in their settings. The environment plays a huge role in what we end up creating in terms of results. I talk a lot about achievement settings, and within achievement settings, there are different types of individuals approach these achievement settings differently. So, if you're a task goal oriented person, in the research, they talk a lot about you having this idea of effort, and hard work leads to improvement, which leads to success. And I do not look at ability as the reason why I can and can't do something. I just know that if I keep working hard, I will get better. So when we tell them and separate the genders just on their gender alone, that doesn't matter how hard I work or how much effort I put in, I'm never going to be as good as the boys. That's where we're kind of telling that young girl that is trying to learn at a younger age, and that can be very damaging. The other side of it is there's also an orientation that's referred to as ego goal orientation. Now, there are there's a lot of research out there about whether or not we are task goal oriented or ego goal oriented, but let me just finish telling you about ego goal orientation. That orientation, if a person is predominantly in that orientation, in an achievement setting, they are typically thinking about their ability right away. And they're always concerned about how they look in that setting and how they're viewed by their peers and how they're viewed by others. And their ability is something that they want to show off and show dominance, but they also want to protect it. They want to protect their self-worth, and they do that by creating environments where they feel they can be successful. So, for example, I'm not going to engage in a co-ed experience because if I can't succeed, then that's going to hurt my self-worth. And I'm going to feel worse about myself. I'm going to lose some self-esteem, and I'm going to not feel like I could be the person that I can be in that sport. So I'm going to choose an activity where I feel I can be successful. But at the same time, that orientation can be, can be understood, but can also be supported through an environment by the coaches or those that are creating that developmental program or sport by not lowering the expectations and by also helping those individuals that have that ego goal orientation to understand that you can work hard and that hard work can lead to success, and you need not worry about your self-esteem or your self-worth because you have these smaller goals that you can achieve and accomplish along the way. So there are some sports where that's already built in, right? Some of the sports they've separated individuals not by gender, but they've separated individuals by their ability or by their weight or by their size, right? And so one of the questions would become, should there be a separation then by necessarily skill level or ability as opposed to really the idea of just separating by the fact that you are male or female or other.
Right. That's so interesting. And as you're talking about, I'm just imagining like ninja athletes. And I think something that, if we're not talking about gender, if we're looking at these other characteristics, something that naturally comes up in conversation is height. Because if you have that height advantage, it's a lot easier to reach certain obstacles. Your wingspan is a lot longer. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't. Are there sports out there that they separate by like a height category? That's something I never thought about.
That's a great question. I have not run across one that purposely will do that, right? So you might see it based on this idea of selection. So if you think about baseball or softball, or if you look at football or basketball, um, you don't say that they separated by height, but in reality, if you look at who's selected and who's drafted and who has the opportunity to play, then you can see that height is a determining factor.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the big things is that a form of discrimination then? Is that really what we want to do? Should we be looking at the individual's skill as opposed to the fact that they are just not as tall as you would like them to be in order to perform what you think would be at a higher level once they get into your program? So that's a really frustrating part for me because I'm not very tall myself, right? So I'm 5'6", and maybe getting shorter now. And one of the things that I've noticed is that I'm always underestimated because of my height, and so I have a spot in my heart for when girls are underestimated because of that too, right? Not just their height, because naturally, if you look at average height for between the genders, the boys are taller and the girls are shorter. Average height for American woman might be somewhere around 5'6". And so naturally, I feel like I'm in the same kind of category when it comes to that level of discrimination, where I'm not going to be looked at or I'm not going to be given the same opportunities only because of my height. And that's really frustrating. And so I can see that same frustration being there for being discriminated against just based on your gender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, to just sticking on the height thing for a second, I was having like two dual thoughts of kind of, you touched on both of them, but typically, not always, but a lot of times guys generally are a little bit taller than women are. And so I was questioning in my mind if that could have anything to do with sometimes guys seeming to perform better on the course. But probably everyone who's listening is like screaming at me through their speaker right now because two of our best women athletes out there, Barclay Stockett and Casey Catanzaro, they're both 5 foot even. And so, you can't make an argument about height when they're way shorter than a lot of us are. And they've performed and made, they're famous for the feats that they've done on American Ninja Warrior. So, it's like the height factor then again kind of disproves itself. As you said, it's like you can't underestimate someone just based on a characteristic like that.
Right, because what we know is that your success in sport and performance is really not only due to your personal physical characteristics, right? So you have your physical characteristics. Once you've gone through puberty, you have a sense of where your body type's going to be. Then you know what you need to do in order to make up for the difference. And then it becomes about being able to perform under pressure. Mm-hmm. And performance under pressure is not something that is exclusive to a gender. So we can say that males are able to perform at a greater level under pressure than females. There's no research that supports that. What we're talking about is who has the determination, the persistence, that persistence in the face of failure. We're driven and motivated by a multitude of other factors that could be more heavily the reason why we perform at a higher level or succeed than, say, our physical characteristics. Mm-hmm. We have to work hard for sure. So when we talk about in sports psychology is I can't help you win a competition or perform better in a competition if you're not skilled, right? You have to work hard at your craft. If you put in the effort and you work hard at your craft and you put your skill level where it needs to be for you to compete with others, then it becomes what's between the ears that can separate you from success and failure. And we have to work on that. And a lot of times for the last 15, 20 years, I've noticed a little bit of a change in this, but for many people, they don't put in the same effort on the mental side of the game as they would for the physical side of the game. Now, mind you, you gain some mental preparation through your practice, through your workouts,
Mm-hmm.
that grinding, that if I push myself harder, and this comes from motor learning research, if I push myself harder in practice, then the competitions and the performances become easier, and I can celebrate my hard work in my performances, and it actually becomes something of a positive feeling, right? I don't feel anxious during competition because I'm ready.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes we see kind of the following happens when we are an amateur athlete and not sure of our skill level. Then we typically experience very little anxiety and stress before we start a competition. And then when we're in the competition, we get a lot of anxiety and stress. And then we don't have a lot of anxiety and stress after the competition. And the reason for that is for the lower skilled athletes, they don't know what they're getting themselves into. And then when they're there, they're freaking out that they're not doing so well. And then when it's over, they're happy it's over.
Yeah. Well, I've definitely experienced that firsthand. I mean, my first year on American Ninja Warrior, I was just like, I'm just so happy to be here. Like, just very excited. And my first year on the course, that was actually the best I've ever done. I made it through almost to the end of the course. And when I fell, I was just like so excited that I fell where I fell because I made it so far. And I made it to city finals, but I experienced that where the second night, it's almost the exact same course. There's the first obstacle was different, but I don't know what happened. I ended up falling on the first obstacle, but it was like one of those things where it was over and I could not believe what just happened because I knew I was capable of getting all the way to the end. And it wasn't even that I felt nervous. It didn't feel nervous going into it. It was more so once I was there, it was like my body just wasn't doing what I was asking it to do, even though I'd already done that the night before.
Mm. Yeah, and we can delve into that specific, reason and the competition and why it turned out the way it did. And that's really what mental performance coaches do is we get to the bottom of the reasons. And then we try to work on what we can do to avoid that moving forward. The big thing is that people that are good at something and they have high skill, then they are anxious usually before competitions because it matters. It's
Mm-hmm.
important to them. And then they have to have a certain amount of coping skills and coping strategies to manage the feelings that they're getting. And then usually when they're in the actual, competition itself, so in this case, in the course, they are experiencing success. And so as soon as they start to experience success, that lowers their anxiety and they get hyper focused on performance and they become more involved in the moment. They control the controllables, which is their effort, their attitude, their focus, their concentration, their arousal regulation. And then they're able to manage for the entire course, right? So if you have too high of an arousal level early on because you're too pumped up, you might run out of gas by halfway or towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about managing that arousal level all the way through the course. And that's a mental state too. It's not just a physical state. So if I'm skilled, I will view a particular course as a challenge, not as a threat. And so if I view something as a threat, then that easily can become a detriment in our performance because now we're going to initiate a physiological response of a fight and flight response system, and our hormones kick in. And one of the things that happens when all these different hormones kick in is that it can lead to you feeling uneasy. It can lead you to you becoming dehydrated, and it can also sap your energy. And so all of those things can become detriments to your performance if it's not managed well mentally, all right, from the start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important. I'm just like, I'm imagining everything you're saying as you're explaining it because I think so many of us have been there, or the opposite. It's like you get so worried before a competition and you're so nervous, but then you go into it and you blow it out of the water. You do an amazing job, and it's like, oh, why was I so nervous?
Yeah, and oftentimes what happens for athletes is when we experience success, we start to lose kind of what's around us. We're able to block that out, and we're able to stay in the moment and stay in the course and stay in what we're trying to do next. and, managing our energy systems throughout.
Mm-hmm.
And so that feels like for many, many people, we oftentimes will refer to this as the zone, right? So what is the mental zone? This is not this is not a gender separation, right? The zone is available for everyone. Anybody can get into the zone. And the problem is how do we get into the zone? And in reality, most of the people that I've been affected by in sports psychology, a lot of them will try to get athletes to focus in on trying to find a way to get into the zone. And I'm more about the individual of how do we maintain consistent effort and consistent performance? Because if you look at the best athletes, it's not that they've excel more at one thing versus another. They are just consistent as heck. They are just really good at having very low amounts of ebb and flow. So they're just very solid all the way through.
I've heard some athletes that I talk to about this kind of explain it almost like they go into it without high expectations, like almost like they go into it seeming like I know I can do well. I know that I'm a good athlete, but I also know, especially with Ninja Warrior, like anything can happen. I can slip weird, an obstacle can move away I don't expect it to move. And so I've heard people that I really look up to say like, oh yeah, I just go into it kind of with very low expectations. And I've always felt like, what do you mean? Like, aren't you confident that you can just do this well? And it's like they are, but it's that weird balance of confidence, but expectations that I guess are managed well.
Yeah, one of the things that's intriguing to me, and whenever I work with a, female student athlete, I typically start with, tell me about your family. I go back into their youth. I want to find out how many brothers and sisters they have. I want to find out if their mom was an athlete. Is their dad an athlete? Was mom and dad supportive equally of their sport participation and performance and activities? What was your grandmother and grandfather like on both sides? Because all of those people can impact our belief system about ourselves and what we can and can't achieve. It's really important that I don't have a daughter, I have a son. And I always wish that maybe I had both, right? So I had a son and a daughter, and I always question, and I talk to my class about this, is would I be, the same type of parent for my daughter as I am for my son in terms of not just, my parenting style, but also the opportunities that I afford for my son. And I'd like to say that I would be the same, right? And unfortunately, what we see is gender separation right from the start as soon as they're born for many families, right? So the boys might have a blue room and the girls might have a pink room. And boys are supposed to play with this toy and girls are supposed to play with that toy. So we're already giving them this separation of gender ideas from when they're first born. And it's a bombardment of gender separation. And it's tough for a parent if you're trying to maintain that gender is not something that we should be considering here. It should just give people opportunities, and whatever it is that you like to do, I'm in support of that opportunity for you to do it, and to not set a limitation in terms of a fear of somebody getting hurt, right? So I always talk to my class about this too. Is when my son was very young, I would wrestle around with him and throw him onto the bed, in a playful way, not in a violent
Right.
way, and knowing that he'd be safe on the bed, of course. And I questioned myself: is if I had a daughter, would I still wrestle around with her and throw her on the bed? Or is it because she's my daughter, I don't do that, and I tend to be a little bit more careful so that she doesn't get hurt, right? So I think that is part of the problem is parenting style. Also, who you're around in terms of your family and your brothers and your sisters and your mom and your dad and your grandmother and your grandfather and the ideas that they've put into your head since you were a little baby. So
Yeah.
it's really impactful. And so you try to unpack that information and data when you talk to the athlete so that they have an understanding of why is it why are you not trying to achieve? Right? So you're there, you want to, compete, you're ready to compete, but you feel like you don't deserve to succeed. That happens sometimes with athletes. They will purposely self-sabotage their own performance. And where that sometimes comes from is that if I lower the expectations, then I have less pressure, less anxiety, and the people around me aren't going to expect as much. But when you do that, you also limit the amount of growth that you can have as an athlete.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I never thought about how all of the family dynamics and just that whole expectation and framework of how you're raised can play into it so much. But I'm like reflecting as you're talking. I'll let myself be a little bit of a case study here. But I grew up with two older brothers, and they would always. I'm also from New Jersey, by the way.
Nice.
But so they'd be out there playing wiffle ball in the street, and I always wanted to play with them, and I was never invited or allowed. I don't know. So I'd end up climbing trees nearby and like watch from the trees. And even growing up in school, my brothers always worked construction with my dad in the summers. And I would ask to work very frequently, and I would be told that I was not invited to work because I was a girl. And I would even be like, Dad, let me come like be your water girl, or I'll serve you guys water and I'll walk around the site and see if you need help. Like I just wanted to be involved somehow. But I think that honestly really drove me to want to be in sports, because I do think I've very much had this need to want to prove myself and have this need to be like, all right, well, if I'm not one of the guys, like in that sense of like wanting to show my, what I can achieve and what I can do, then okay, then I'm going to do it in sports. And I think that's been one of the driving factors for me, which sometimes is probably to my downfall, having that need to prove myself almost to my demise, maybe sometimes. But sometimes I think it works in my favor, and it pushes me to work really hard, and I don't feel afraid to go out there and do my best. But sometimes I think maybe I put too much pressure on myself.
So that's great for you because you were able to have a positive reaction to that challenge. So what my worries are is, what about all the women or young girls that had the opposite reaction, where they accepted it and they didn't push themselves, they didn't take the risks, they didn't put themselves in those situations to want to prove others wrong.
Right.
And so what are we losing with this model? And unfortunately, basically the way this works historically is that for centuries, right, women have not been given equal opportunity and access in much of the societal norms. And, sport is one of those. Of course, Title IX, when it came in 1972, was really written for an educational purpose, right? So it was equal opportunity and access for schools, and people wanted to sign off on young girls, their daughters, having the same educational access as their sons. And then, of course, they added in there school activities as well. And as soon as they added in school activities, that meant sport programs. And so when they had to share the budget with the boys, one of the things that happens, of course, is this changing of the guard, right? So now all of a sudden girls have opportunities and access and the funds potentially to participate. Now, I'm not saying it's equal. It's still not equal today. There's a lot of facilities. There's a lot of scheduling issues, uniforms. There's a lot of unequitable areas in terms of sport, but we're moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, we're talking about 1972 as the introduction of this. So we're talking about generational gaps, right? So we need people like yourself who potentially, let's say you had a daughter. Now you would raise your daughter a little bit differently, perhaps than how you were raised, right? In terms of gender and gender roles when it comes to sport and physical activities. And then let's say she has a daughter. Now we're talking about 2-3 generations later where we start to see some of these things change. So some of the things that we're looking for in terms of changes are starting to come, because obviously right now, when we first came in, they said separate, right? Let's separate the sports. Let's separate the genders. The boys play here, the girls play there. And one of the things that's been happening, of course, is that women have really done well in sport. They're succeeding. They're athletic. They're showing that they can compete. If you look at women's tennis, compared to men's tennis, we had that whole battle of the sexes, right? That occurred with the WTA and the United States Tennis Professional Leagues. And that created opportunities for women in tennis. So one of the big things that I'm seeing, at least, is that we're starting to see that girls can do it. They can be successful. We need some more time for some of these things to show themselves, down another generation or two. But the thing that's really causing these the wheels to turn a little faster is that the question about, what about mixed gender or individuals that don't identify with a particular gender? What do we do with athletes that are not necessarily male or female, identified as male or female? And how do we make sense of that? And so because of these things, we're having to kind of really think about how sport is organized. And I think this is a great topic because it really is pushing the research needle where it needs to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I previously was talking with another Ninjababes team member about that topic of, what about transgender athletes or, like you said, athletes who don't necessarily identify with a specific gender. And we were saying how, Ninja has historically been set up in such a beautiful way that if we don't separate the courses, then we already have solved that problem, and we already are only competing on one course. But then it's the question, at least how our sport is set now, of do we have a different podium, or how does that work with showing achievement for male and female or transgender? So I know it's definitely a topic that I've thought about a lot and want to know that our sport and what we're doing can be part of pushing us toward, a better future in that way.
Yeah,
But
I
you touched
think
on, yeah, go ahead.
I think that's really right where I kind of wanted the conversation to go with next, is this idea that if we set up a sport or an activity in a gender specific way, what are the potential pros and cons? So if we look at a sport that's was separated out for girls, we can look at softball. So if we're looking at softball in comparison to baseball, what have we done? We've created shorter bases. Are we saying that girls can't run 90 feet? They can only run 60 feet? Right?
Right.
Why do we have to have shorter bases for girls in softball? They can run 90 feet. We've seen it in track and field. They can do it. And they can do
Right.
it. They can do it very quickly too. And also, why do we have to have shorter distances in terms of the fences? And why are they playing with a larger softball, which actually makes it more difficult to throw and throw further? So one of the things that's really confusing in some of these models is it working? Is it successful? And the most disturbing model, of course, is when sports try to sell gender through sex appeal, right? They try to sell their sport, through sex appeal. And that is a very short-lived return in terms of benefit. We can argue certain sports are, the more popular athletes in the female sports sides is the females that are being, promoted based on their appearance, not necessarily their skill level. And we're not doing them any favors, and you're not doing your sport any favors by trying to sell your sport through sex appeal.
Yeah, I think that's something we don't necessarily talk a lot about on the podcast, but it does come up, but we haven't talked about it in that way. But that is really important point. I had a conversation with my fiance about this, talking about how, there's quote unquote the sexy sports. Like he would argue that CrossFit is one of those, just where, I don't know, just the appearance of, is it more about what your body looks like when you're doing the sport, or is it more about your ability and your skill in your sport? And I think that's something that's really important to talk about, especially because I was just having a conversation on another podcast yesterday with Sarah Heason, one of our ninja athletes, who is saying that she's gotten called out for training in her gym in a sports bra. And she's a coach at the gym. She usually doesn't coach like that, but she will train herself like that.
Yep.
And just being, I don't know, given a hard time about why is she training like that? And she was like, well, it's hot and the gym is
Yeah.
really warm and I want to feel comfortable and working out. But it's, in that respect, it's, I don't know. I feel like I don't know what the answer should be. It is a personal decision, but it's also like, what is your motivation? Are you truly just really warm, or are you trying to feel like you feel sexier while you're working out? Her and I had this conversation and she was like, no, I'm really just sweating over here and it's very warm in the gym. There's no air conditioning in the gym. So, but I realize where that comes up. And even with Ninjababes, the name Ninjababes, if you just read that on a page, you might, without any context, might wonder like, where is this coming from? But within our sport of ninja, it's just that it's really just the point of camaraderie and empowerment to women and just feeling this sisterhood where we can support one another, encourage one another without the cattiness, without any sort of that negativity. But I think it's important for women to think about like, what is the goal of, of fitness even? Like, this is going on a totally different tangent, but I remember growing up, it was always like models and people you looked at were always just extremely skinny, and that was quote unquote beautiful. But now it's like the fit models who are like very muscular but very toned, and like it's presented as sexy but like in a different way comparatively to like just really skinny versus like skinny and fit.
Well, it's interesting. Historically, that's changed over so many centuries, right? So early on, girls that were participating in sport were viewed as, that there must be lesbians. They must be, homosexuals in some way because they're participating in a masculinized physical activity that's been organized and developed by men. And then, of course, then we move on historically into the European history, and we have a period of time when people that were, actually bigger in size and less active were viewed as more attractive because they must have resources. Look at this. They've got a lot of food and they're eating a lot of food. They must be rich, so they're desirable. And now we move into the fitness age and this idea of being healthy. And now we are more inclined to view people that are, skinny as being healthy. But in reality, there's bias there too, right? So just because I'm skinny doesn't make me fit, right? I could be a person that's very lazy and sedentary and not move much at all and be very unfit, and actually might have a shorter lifespan span as opposed to somebody that is very fit. Although potentially their body type might be a little bit bigger, but they work very hard and are technically more fit. So one of the things that's really important to talk about moving into your activity in sport is really the future of the sport, right? So making sure that there are girls out there that are probably let's say they're in middle school now, or maybe even earlier than that in elementary school. What are the types of activities or things they need to do in order to put themselves in position when they get a little bit older to participate in some of these activities in a high level of success rate? And one of those, of course, is participating in activities that are strength oriented, but also activities that are vigorous in nature. Right? So some of the research that I've looked at from the physical education side has shown some disturbing trends in terms of gender differences, where the girls are doing less vigorous physical activities and less strength training activities. And that's not going to be supportive of the sport, right? So the idea is, what can we do within the earlier populations in middle school to get these girls to understand that strength training is not a male endeavor. Strength training is a human endeavor. You have muscles, males have girls have same muscles as boys do. Maybe they're a little bit different in length, but that's true of any gender, right? Within the gender, there might be even more differences than there are between genders. And so one of the big things is to get them to realize the value of strength and muscular strength and muscular endurance activities to be healthy. So in PE, we talk about these as health-related fitness concepts, right? So one is aerobic fitness, which I was talking about in terms of their intensity level so they can become cardiovascularly healthy. And then the other side is muscular strength and endurance, flexibility, and then body composition as a result of the things that you do. So your body will, change in its composition because of the activities you're participating in. So those are the things that can be really focused on in terms of their, goals and moving forward, and understanding that if they're not moving with a higher level of intensity, then they're not becoming fit. And that fitness is really what we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about real quick was, this using an example of a sport that does not separate based on gender, although we don't have a lot of participants, and that's wrestling. One of the things that is starting to happen, though, over the last 10 to 15 years is more and more girls are participating alongside with the boys in the sport of wrestling. And the sport itself, if you look at least the high school level, does not separate based on gender. So even here in our local high school, at Keene High School, they have a number of girls competing on the wrestling team alongside against the boys. And the important lesson that can be gained from this is that they're not looking at the girl for their gender. They're looking at the person and their ability. Can you compete at this weight class level with your ability? So are you a junior varsity athlete or a varsity athlete based on your wrestling ability? All right. And so one of the natural things, of course, somebody might say is, well, the girls aren't as strong as the boys. Well, there was a number of times I could just tell you as a wrestler where I wrestled people that were stronger than me, and I still won because I was more tactical, right? So there are other things that you can do to still achieve success in a sport or activity that need not be based on power. So even in baseball or softball, I don't necessarily have to be a power hitter. I can be a hitter that hits for average. I can be a defensive specialist. I can do different things in a sport or activity that can make me more successful based on my body type. So as being a 5'5", 5'6" athlete, I learned how to be good at other parts of the games. In football, I participated in football at 5'5". When I was a freshman in high school, I weighed 89 pounds.
Oh my goodness.
89 pounds. And I was a wrestler, and I was a football player, and I was a baseball player. I was basically, giving up a lot of advantages, right? I didn't have the power. I didn't have the weight behind it. I was giving up 10 pounds in the lowest weight class. But I learned to do other things. Like you said, when something is not available to you, or you feel like you've been disadvantaged, sometimes that is a motivating factor. And that in itself can lead you down a path of working harder and being more successful.
Yeah, I think that's great for our audience to hear, because something we constantly talk about in Ninja is strategy. You need to have course strategy if you're going to be successful. And a lot of it also is when you're training and when you're working out in the gym, realizing, okay, maybe I'm shorter. Okay, that means my wingspan's not as far, not as wide. So when I'm doing certain obstacles that are upper body climbing, I might need to really learn how to use the movement of my hips and my knees to help propel me in the direction I want to go, and not just rely on my upper body strength or the way that my arm is going to reach. And so that strategy is so key, and I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's just an important point to make over and over again in this podcast is that, there's the same kind of differences within the same sex as you might be thinking there is between the different sexes and gender. In fact, there might be even more within the same sex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one thing I want to just pull back to, as this can kind of be like our last topic, unless there's more that you do want to share. But this is actually something that Mary Layton had said a few weeks back on an earlier episode. And a point that she made is that we have never seen what a generation of girls is capable of when they grow up knowing they can compete with the boys. And so just kind of to that point of what we've been saying of we generationally I feel like we haven't really seen what a generation of girls can do physically in their performance when they're not given any limiting mindset, or when they're not treated as if they should be different than how the boys perform. And so I know, especially with Ninjababes and what we're doing within Ninja Warrior, I want to continue to see how we can cultivate this environment of girls just feeling empowered and not even realizing that there, quote unquote, should be a difference when you're looking at the older generations, that just feeling like this is the way it is and I don't have to feel limited in any way.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think one of the things that really comes out to me, even, it's as I train physical education teachers to treat, students equally and not to look at them in terms of their gender. One of the things that's important is to remove your own biases. So teachers, coaches, parents, we struggle with how we were raised, and being able to remove that gender bias in our own minds. Now I'm not pointing it out in terms of a negative, but one of the big things that we talk to our students is not to use the term "you guys." And although it's something that's in a lot of sports, it is again perpetuating gender descriptive languages. And we want to remove those gender languages from how we talk to people. And so she plays like a boy or she plays like a girl. That we have to give girls a head start or give them extra points, or be a little more kinder or be a little bit softer, or don't give the same kind of feedback. So we change a lot of the ways that we teach or coach because we think this is what they need. And in fact, we're actually marginalizing them by doing that.
Yeah, that's so powerful to hear. And it makes a lot of sense. And I know we've talked a lot about this a lot this episode, and I really appreciate just outlining some of those examples of how it can come up, like, giving extra time to girls, or the softball example is such a perfect example. Do you have any other advice of what are even little things like you just mentioned about you guys, or, you play like a girl or whatever? Are there any other pieces of advice that you notice that happens in coaching scenarios or in training scenarios that can continue to perpetuate like those bad habits that we don't want to continue?
Yeah, I think sometimes we underestimate the competitiveness that a person has based on their gender. That they're not going to want it as much, or that they're not, for example, they might not be as confident, right? So one of the things that comes when you talk about confidence in itself, one of the biggest things is you gain confidence from perceptions of success. So if I do well at something, then my confidence starts to build. And once I receive positive information and positive outcomes based on my performances, then my confidence continues to build. But we cannot set limitations on individuals based on gender and suggest that they cannot be as competitive, or they cannot be as confident, or they cannot achieve the same limits, because we set that bar from the beginning. And we have to really be mindful and careful about that so that we don't discourage them, and actually set, kind of plant the seed already for them that that's what's going to happen, that they just not need to be that competitive. They don't need to be that confident, because it doesn't matter as much for you as it would for my son, for example.
Yeah,
these it's okay. Whereas you would say something very different, if it was for the male or for the son. So I've had gender panel discussions in class, because I also teach a principles of coaching class at Keene State College. And I've had all the Keene State College coaches come in. And one of the interesting dynamics is that we have coaches that are males teaching women's sports, and we have females teaching women's sports. So we have two very different, situations that are going on in terms of the gender of the coach coaching women in sports. That is obviously, in this case, singled out into their own gender. So, for example, it might be a women's lacrosse versus women's volleyball or women's track and field. Now, the most interesting part is kind of the track and field sport, because there's a male sport that coaches male athletes and female athletes. But then a male coaching a female sport with female athletes versus a female coaching female sports with female athletes. And one of the things that I've learned from that gender panel discussion was that it seemed like the women coaches were saying, treat them the same. Don't treat them any different. Give them the same kinds of feedback you would give anyone regardless of gender. And then some of the male coaches were talking a little bit about the fact that they are more sensitive to feedback. So there seems to be some gender differences from the coaches in terms of dealing with their own, understanding of how to coach when they're coaching the different genders. And so I think there's some areas that we need to figure out in terms of what's the best coaching style, as opposed to how am I coaching a male or a female.
Yeah. I mean, that opens up a whole new topic. I know in Ninja Warrior, we've had a lot of questions from male coaches working with females of how do I be careful not to be blamed for something like inappropriate when we're spotting or when we're doing these skin to skin type of contact, depending on what it is that's happening in the gym. But I know that's something that comes up a lot. And I think perhaps to some extent, that's where that hesitancy comes from, and feeling like you need to be more careful or more cautious or soft or whatever, is just like that fear of something being taken the wrong way.
Yeah, I agree 100%. One of the things that really is challenging for coaches is really trying to navigate the how much can I actually support this person, in what fashion before I put myself at risk. So we oftentimes talk about this as have an open door policy, always have an assistant coach there. But you know what? These things can go both ways. They go both ways, regardless of gender. You could be a female coach or a male coach, and you're both at risk when you are get into a situation of a he said, she said. And so we always say keep an open door and make sure that you ask for permissions. Right. So, and there's other people around you to corroborate the story. So I'm not working on a one-on-one situation. I'm in a group setting, and I've asked permission for me to put my hands in a certain place.
Right. Yeah, we've had a lot of discussion about this recently, but I think that's the best you could do is constantly asking for consent, explaining what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Even
is it okay if I put my hands on your hips to support you in this squat?
Right. Yeah.
And that, I mean, that's basically all you can do.
Yeah. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about in regards to any of these topics?
Just the take-home message is that, we're making good progress, I think, in sport overall. If we look at it from afar, from a distance, and look at it historically, we have to, oftentimes we want to see immediate change. But some things are cyclical in nature, and unfortunately, sometimes we move backwards before we can move forwards, and we want to see change happen right away. But historically speaking, I think that we're moving in the right direction. We have some things where, at least now we're seeing women participating in sport at a high level. They're, not necessarily equal participation and access, but they are participating at least 40%, if not higher percentage of athletes are females as opposed to males. We're sharing the budgets. And I think that a lot of sports are at least considering their models of what it is appropriate for their sport. And should there be a separation for gender is a real big question today. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk to you about that topic.
Yeah, I really value all of your insight, and it's been awesome having you on. And I'm sure so many people are just eating this up, so excited to listen. So thank you. And probably if I might hit you up with some follow-up questions or just feedback from the community, because I'm sure that this episode is going to get a lot of discussion afterwards.
Sounds great. Thank you.